Here it is, Brick Fanatics, the Lego Game Boy, something which looks a little bit better than maybe some people were expecting. Sometimes the best Lego sets are the ones that are brimming with creative potential, and I definitely feel like this is one of those Lego sets. This thing is near 1-to-1 scale with the original actual DMG Game Boy from 1989. It's very much made in the same design style as the Nintendo Entertainment Lego system we got a few years ago, a more or less faithful recreation of a console in brick-built form. I suppose you could also throw in, say, the Pac-Man arcade machine, although that's a bit smaller, and the Atari that we've had as well in this camp. This design is pretty cute. It's got some interesting pieces in here. Are these tires, for example, used for the start and select buttons? And of course we've got some wonderful printing on these cartridges to make them really shine, as well as other little details such as this one, this sloped piece here, kind of curved around with the speaker lines in, is interesting, as well as a few other printed pieces that are filling in a few of the little details of the console. It's a fascinating looking thing. The highlight for me though are these lenticular screens that you can swap in and swap out to be different games, and I think that that's just a fascinating way of recreating the Game Boy's screen. And that's part of why I'm so interested to see what the LEGO fan community comes up with, because I've got two ideas for custom projects in my head already, and I can't imagine I'll be the only one to think of these. Leaving aside the idea of LEGO, what about making some kind of hybrid additions to this thing? Wait, hang on, let me just... There we go, that's a bit better, slightly easier on the eyes. If you're not in the fan community for the Game Boy, you might not necessarily know this, but there's a very large market that is getting increasingly potent, I would say, and increasingly profitable for some people, that comes from stripping off the original cases for these things and taking off these original, very difficult to see screens and putting new screens on, modding these things, changing them up, making them a little bit more modern. I forgot about the contrast wheel on this thing and just how difficult it is to get right in the right spot. That's one thing you can do. You can also get some of these new emulator machines which are designed to play the games in miniature form. If I turn this thingy on, you don't necessarily have to play old school original games because that would be piracy, and this channel is not supporting piracy, but there are all kinds of other things that you can play if you so choose, like for example this one, which I made myself. Oh no. The same is true on the software side of things. If you have not partaken of the Game Boy homebrew community, you are missing out because there are some incredibly talented Game Boy developers still making games for hardware that was obsolete 20 plus years ago at this point. A lot of these are bedroom coders doing it in their own spare time, aware that they are never going to reach a massive audience, but really eager to play with the Game Boy because the Game Boy is such a unique canvas for creativity. I don't imagine it's going to be very long before somebody tries taking the actual hardware from a Game Boy or just the hardware from the inside of one of these emulation machines and puts that into this Lego console. In fact, I reckon that's going to be a video that goes up within a week of this thing hitting store shelves, if not sooner. There are going to be people on YouTube who are almost immediately going to be modding this Lego set so that it is an actual working Game Boy. Another thing that I think is going to be really fun to see is what people do with these lenticular screens. In the box, you've got the Nintendo logo, if that's the kind of thing you want to have. You've got Link's Awakening, and you've got Super Mario Land 1, arguably the more difficult of the Super Mario Land games. And that's fine and all, but let's be honest here, the real games that people want for their little Lego Game Boy is not Super Mario Land, it's Pokemon. Or alternatively, it's something like Tetris. It's the game that this thing was actually bundled with, but Tetris is owned by the Tetris company, which is a completely different entity from Nintendo, and so there would have been another licensing issue. I think I went over this in our previous video on the Lego Game Boy, how it just makes sense to stick with Nintendo as a partner, and so Super Mario Land and Link's Awakening are the logical choices here. And that's an area, again, where I feel like the LEGO fan community and the Game Boy fan community are probably going to be able to provide something that is not in the box here, because on the one hand, yeah, you could stick to the lenticular screens that come with this thing, but on the other hand, printing lenticular things is not that expensive. I wouldn't be surprised if not very long after this thing launches, if not before, we start seeing listings on Etsy, for example, for custom different game screens that you can just pop in here instead of the ones that come in the box. Something tells me that if you're a LEGO fan watching this video and you're not really into Game Boys, you might be surprised just how creative the fan community around this little thing can be. Now, if you're looking at my Game Boy here in particular, you might notice one thing that I think is unfortunately a little bit off about the Lego Game Boy. It is something that was always going to be difficult to reproduce. The colouring of the console. Not just the incredibly yellowed colouring of this thing, which would be quite difficult to recreate in Lego, but the colouring even of the fresh ones that have not actually seen quite as much sunlight as this one. And of course, there are people watching this video thinking, nah, Lego's going to do really well at that authentic slow weathering and yellowing over time. And of course, it's really noticeable with the cartridges, because the cartridges are definitely not the right colour. But it shouldn't really be too much of a surprise that the Game Boy fandom is so creative in its own weird way, because the Game Boy itself is a piece of wonderful creative ingenuity, and in fact the games that are coming with this Lego Game Boy are very much a part of a legacy of weird, fun creativity within Nintendo. So, Super Mario Land, designed by the team that made the Game Boy, headed by Gunpei Yokoi, who I talked about in a previous video on the Lego Game Boy, and indeed on the history of the Game Boy itself. Yokoi and his team Research and Development 1 were tasked with making not just the Game Boy itself, but games for the Game Boy, and initially they were given the brief of just make copies of the big games that we have on the Nintendo Entertainment System in a smaller miniature package. So you've got this one, and then you've also got something like Metroid 2, which is another one which is kind of doing the same thing as somebody else, and Research and Development 1 didn't like this. Because ultimately it's not much fun to just copy somebody else's homework. They wanted to make their own thing, and so when they made a sequel to this one, they made Super Mario Land 2, and it is a radically different game to basically any other game that bears Mario's name. That in turn led to the creation of Wario Land instead, where they said, you know what, the hero, the mascot, the star for the Game Boy is not just Mario, because Mario is Miyamoto's thing. We've got Wario, the weird, evil, twisted version of Mario. And I won't lie, these Wario games are some of my absolute favourites of all time. I like this one so much that I have it twice. So creativity was really baked into the Game Boy in a big way. You can see that as well if you look at the other game, Link's Awakening. The game started as a side project by Kazuhiko Morita out of normal office hours, where he was tinkering away with a Game Boy development kit, just kind of seeing what he could get away with this thing. He wasn't even really supposed to have it. He'd been working on this game, or at least the Super Nintendo version of it, A Link to the Past, and that having wrapped up, he was now curious to see what he could get out of the Game Boy and whether he could port a Zelda game onto the Game Boy instead. That was his initial goal, but as more people joined his project, which was all very, very hush hush, don't tell the managers, they ended up morphing it into something completely different, something that one of them described as a parody of a Zelda game, because they could just kind of do whatever they wanted. This was for fun. So they threw in, for example, Kirby and Yoshi and a bunch of Mario enemies, and even this guy that looks suspiciously like Mario himself. They put into this thing whatever they felt like, because it wasn't ever meant to be a commercial release. It was just a fun little side project. It was also very heavily inspired by Twin Peaks, of all things, so the story of the game is quite trippy compared to most Zelda fare. In the end, they did up taking this thing to their higher-ups and said, look what we've made here, can we finish this? And they were like, yeah, go on then. And so we get Link's Awakening, which is one of the most beloved of all of the Game Boy games, and one of the most beloved of all of the Zelda games. So while, no, the games represented in the Lego Game Boy set are not Pokemon and are not Tetris, which are two of the biggest games for the Game Boy, but they are games that reflect the creative spark, the imagination and the weirdness that went into this little handheld, and which are reflected in the catalogue of games that released for the device. That, I think, is very fitting for the Lego Game Boy, and as said, I absolutely definitely look forward to seeing what the fan community come up with for this thing, because I imagine that a playable Game Boy will be fairly easy to get hold of before too long, or certainly the instructions for it if nothing else, and I do imagine that we'll see some other lenticular screens show up for this thing for anybody who wants to customize their Game Boy and make it a Pokemon game instead of a Mario or a Zelda game. I did consider using this camera to try and film the video, but for various reasons that was not going to be practical, not least because this thing has a frame rate of like 1 frame a minute, so it wasn't exactly going to look any better than the weird little animated intro I made for this video. But what do you think of the Lego Game Boy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below, and while you're there, do all of the rest of the YouTube things. Give this video a thumbs up, hit subscribe and the notification bell. If you're going to be purchasing anything from the Lego website in the near future, you can use the affiliate link which is in the description, or the QR code that is on screen to take you straight to the Lego website. We get a percentage of the sale. It doesn't cost you a penny extra, but it helps to keep the lights on at Brick Fanatics. Speaking of which, you can go to brickfanatics.com for coverage of all things Lego, including far more about the Lego Game Boy, and you can sign up to our newsletter so that you never miss anything Lego related ever again. Thank you very much for watching and have a wonderful day.